Grand Canyon visitors who come across the statue of Brighty will likely assume he's a beloved character with a touching story, then rub his nose for good luck and walk on. But his story is darker and more complex than you might assume. Even the statue of Brighty was embroiled in controversy. And please be advised, this video is not for young children. Brighty was a real donkey who lived most of his life at the Grand Canyon. He was named for Bright Angel Creek, a location he frequented, and he lived most of his life at the Grand Canyon as a free spirit with a fondness for humans. Brighty was brought to the canyon in 1890 by two miners who likely perished trying to cross the Colorado River to get to South Rim, leaving Brighty to survive on his own. He was found near the tent of his former owners, near where Phantom Creek intersects with Bright Angel Creek, but he later followed a traveler up to the North Rim. Thereafter, he would regularly travel to the North Rim in the warm months, then back into the canyon in the cold, a pattern he followed for more than 30 years. Brighty was never captured or corralled, but he was willing to let young kids ride on his back, and he was fond of hanging around humans. Starting in 1916, there was a tourist accommodation on North Rim known as Wiley Camp. Brighty formed a bond with the young son of the operators, Bob McKee. At the time, water for the camp came from a spring about half a mile away. Brighty allowed Bob to saddle him with two water containers weighing about 200 pounds filled, and Bob paid him with pancakes. In the mornings, Bob would go out and call, "Pancakes, Brighty," and the free roaming mule would appear. They would make several trips a day for water, during which Bob rewarded Brighty with more pancakes. The girls at the camp asked who the boss was, and Bob replied that he and Brighty were partners. When one teased that Bob was beginning to look like Brighty, Bob replied, "I'll lend him to you for a while if you think it will improve your looks." Brighty's free and independent spirit was well respected by most in the canyon. Grand Canyon became a national park in 1919. At that time, the only way of crossing the Colorado River was a cable car, and the park decided to build a bridge in the winter of 1920-21. Since this was his winter home, Brighty hung out with the workers and even helped carry some loads. When the bridge was complete, considering that Brighty was the oldest inhabitant of the area, he was designated as the first person to officially cross the completed bridge. But the bridge would lead to Brighty's untimely death. The very next winter, a thief who stole $6,000 of Liberty bonds from the home of an elderly man in southern Arizona used the new bridge to make his way across the river with the intent of escaping to Utah. He already knew of Brighty from casing the area and put a lead on him and brought him to the North Rim. On the way, the thief put his gun and provisions on a tree, planning to come back for them after reaching the cabin, but a heavy snow covered his trail and he arrived with no means to hunt and limited food. That year, the snows were particularly heavy on the North Rim. A short time later, another traveler, a Marine, came along and after a fight ended up staying in the cabin as well. The Marine knew of another cabin nearby, but with the heavy snows and food being very limited, they killed Brighty with an axe and literally had him for dinner. They were snowed in for 3 months and eventually even used Brighty's bones to make soup. Eventually, the men made it to a neighboring cabin. The thief, reprovisioned, chose to avoid the nearest town and left in a blizzard, trying to make it to Utah. Nothing more is known of him. The other man survived, but lost his feet due to frostbite. In 1922, Tom McKee, Bob's father, wrote an article for Sunset magazine about Brighty's wild and free nature, but not including the details of his death. Surprisingly, 30 years later, popular author Marguerite Henry went to a library to do research for a book about donkeys, and the librarian gave her Tom McGee's Sunset Magazine article. Taken by the concept, Henry traveled to Grand Canyon, rode to Phantom Ranch, and camped at Cliff Springs, researching her book. She even bought a donkey of her own named Jiggs that she observed to help her write Brighty of the Grand Canyon. Ms. Henry did not know of Bob McGee when she wrote her book, but she decided to add a boy to it, which she modeled after her neighbor Tex, who formed a relationship with her donkey Jiggs and even taught him tricks. She must have been aware of Brighty's untimely demise, as Brighty almost becomes dinner in her book, but in the fictitious account, he survives. The book was made into a popular movie released in 1966. The donkey in that movie was Marguerite Henry's own Jiggs, and Tex, then an adult, came along as Jiggs's trainer. The director of the movie had a statue of Brighty cast and eventually donated it to the park in 1967, where it was initially placed in the South Rim Visitor Center. But here is where fiction clashes with reality. Brighty was one of a number of donkeys who lived wild in the park. The Park Service determined donkeys were not native to the area, and starting in 1924, began exterminating them. That included driving them off cliffs, poisoning them, and shooting them. Rangers were authorized to shoot wild donkeys on sight. Some were sold for dog food, but if not near a trail, the majority were left to decompose where they were killed. The donkey eradication continued through the decades, with 2,600 being killed, and new technologies like shooting the donkeys from helicopters were adopted. In an effort to reinforce to the public that donkeys were not native to the canyon, the statue of Brighty was first moved to a back porch of the visitor center, and eventually it was hidden away in storage. But changing social values and increased news coverage led to a public uproar about the methods of the park's donkey eradication. The book and the movie about Brighty likely contributed to public outrage as well. A substantial fundraising effort raised $1.5 million to remove the donkeys humanely. Eventually, this humane effort succeeded where the kills had failed, and along with the fence, donkeys were eliminated from the park. There was a public campaign to bring back Brighty's statue, and eventually, after the elimination of all donkeys from the park, he was quietly placed in the sunroom of the North Rim Lodge with minimal comment or explanation. The statue remains in that state to this day, with most visitors taking a glance, rubbing his nose for good luck, and moving on. Brighty and his kind have been eliminated from the Grand Canyon for decades now. But the last paragraph from Henry's book suggests another ending. Especially on moonlit nights, a shaggy little form can be seen flirting along the ledges, a thin swirl of dust rising behind him. Some say it's nothing but moonbeams caught up in a cloud. But the older guides swear it is trail dust out of the past, kicked up by Brighty himself, the roving spirit of the Grand Canyon. Forever wild, forever free.